Hi, I'm Stacey. My own parents convinced me to sign over my life insurance policy to my sister Madison, claiming it was just temporary paperwork for a family loan. 3 weeks later, I woke up in a hospital bed with no memory of how my car ended, up wrapped around a tree on a mountain road I'd never driven before. The police called it an accident. The insurance investigator called it suspicious. I called it the moment I realized my family had been planning my death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I didn't confront them immediately. I didn't call the police. I simply vanished into the night with nothing but a backpack and the growing certainty that the people who raised me had tried to kill me for money. Some betrayals cut so deep they change your DNA. The whole nightmare started 6 months earlier, on what should have been a celebration. I'd just gotten promoted to senior accountant at Henderson Associates in Phoenix, my first real career breakthrough at 26. The salary bump meant I could finally afford my own place, maybe even start that master's degree I'd been putting off. I was buzzing with excitement when I walked into my parents' house that Thursday evening, ready to share the good news over Mom's famous enchiladas. Robert, my dad, was in his usual spot on the recliner, scrolling through his phone with that permanent frown he'd developed since the construction company laid him off 2 years ago. Linda, my mom, emerged from the kitchen wiping flour from her hands, her smile tight in that way that usually meant bills were overdue again. Madison lounged on the couch, perfectly manicured nails tapping against her phone screen, as she filmed another one of her lifestyle videos for her modest but growing social media following. The living room felt smaller than usual, cramped with the tension that had become our family's default setting since Dad lost his job and Mom's part-time work at the dental office barely covered groceries. Madison had moved back home after her marketing startup failed, and at 24, she'd settled into a routine of treating our parents' house like a free hotel, while she figured out her next move. I announced my promotion with the enthusiasm of someone who thought good news could fix everything. Dad looked up from his phone for exactly 3 seconds before grunting something that might have been congratulations. Mom hugged me with the distracted air of someone mentally calculating whether my news meant I'd be moving out and taking my contribution to household expenses with me. Madison barely glanced up from her phone, though I caught her rolling her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. The conversation that changed everything happened after dinner, when Madison suddenly perked up with an idea that she presented like she'd just solved world hunger. She'd been researching insurance policies for a business plan, she explained, and discovered that as young, healthy women, we could get substantial life insurance coverage for relatively low premiums. The key was timing, she said, before we got married or had health issues that would drive up costs. Dad jumped on the idea immediately, his face lighting up with the kind of enthusiasm he usually reserved for lottery tickets and get-rich-quick schemes. He started talking about how smart it was to plan ahead, how responsible we'd be to secure our futures. Mom nodded along, adding that it would give them peace of mind knowing we were protected. Madison painted a picture of financial security and family responsibility that made me feel selfish for not having thought of it myself. The pressure was subtle but constant over the following weeks. Every family dinner included some mention of the insurance policies. Dad would bring up stories about people who died young and left their families with nothing. Mom would worry aloud about what would happen to Madison if something happened to me, since I was the one with the steady job and savings account. Madison herself played the perfect supporting role, researching policies and presenting options like she was doing me a favor. I should have questioned why they were so invested in my life insurance policy. I should have wondered why Madison needed me to get coverage when she could have gotten her own. I should have noticed how quickly they'd found an agent and scheduled appointments. But I was 26 and still desperately wanted my family's approval. When your parents spend years making you feel like the responsible one, the one who has to hold everything together, you start to believe that questioning their judgment makes you ungrateful. The insurance agent, a smooth-talking man named Kevin, who met us at a coffee shop near our house, made everything sound perfectly normal. He explained term life insurance like he was selling us coffee, casual and friendly. The policy he recommended was substantial, enough to pay off a house and then some. But he assured us that young, healthy people like Madison and me were actually the perfect candidates for this kind of coverage. The premiums were manageable, especially if we signed up together for a family discount. I signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon, right after work. Madison sat beside me, signing her own identical policy with a pen that matched her nail polish. Everything seemed normal. Routine, even. Just two sisters planning responsibly for the future. The agent explained the beneficiary designations, and I listed Madison as my primary beneficiary without thinking twice about it. She was my only sibling, and our parents already had each other. It seemed logical. What I didn't know was that 3 days later, Madison would go back to Kevin's office alone and change the beneficiary on my policy. Instead of a simple sibling designation, she added herself as primary beneficiary with our parents, Robert and Linda, as secondary beneficiaries. She also added a clause that would allow her to manage any claims or policy changes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The paperwork required my signature, but Madison had been practicing my handwriting since high school. She'd always been good at forgery, a skill I'd discovered when she used to sign my name on permission slips and report cards. I didn't find out about any of this until much later, when a kind insurance investigator named Patricia Williams would show me the fraudulent documents while I recovered in a North Carolina hospital room. But that Tuesday afternoon, signing what I thought was a straightforward insurance policy, I felt good about being responsible. I felt like maybe I was finally doing something that would make my parents proud of me instead of just financially dependent on me. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after we signed the policies. I came home from work to find Madison crying in the kitchen while Mom rubbed her shoulders and Dad paced around the table like a caged animal. They explained that Madison had been in a minor car accident, nothing serious, but the other driver was threatening to sue. Their insurance would cover most of it, but there might be gaps, and Madison was terrified about being financially ruined before her life even got started. The solution they proposed seemed reasonable at first. Since Madison was listed as my beneficiary anyway, why didn't I temporarily sign over management of my policy to her? That way, if she needed to borrow against it to cover legal expenses, she could handle the paperwork without having to bother me. It would just be temporary, until the lawsuit was resolved. Dad explained it like it was a simple family loan, the kind of thing families do for each other. I hesitated, not because I suspected anything sinister, but because I didn't understand insurance well enough to know if this was normal. Madison immediately picked up on my uncertainty and launched into a tearful explanation about how scared she was, how she couldn't sleep knowing she might lose everything over one stupid accident. Mom joined in, talking about how family members should support each other, especially when one of us finally had the means to help. The emotional manipulation was expertly done. They made me feel like questioning the arrangement meant I didn't trust my own sister, that I was being selfish with resources that would eventually be hers anyway. Dad pulled out paperwork that Kevin, the insurance agent, had supposedly prepared, all official-looking with legal language that went over my head. All I had to do was sign a transfer of management form, giving Madison temporary control over policy decisions. I signed it on a Thursday evening, right there at the kitchen table where we'd eaten thousands of family dinners. Madison hugged me afterward, tears in her eyes as she thanked me for being such an amazing sister. Mom made my favorite dessert, chocolate chip cookies, and Dad actually put his arm around my shoulder and called me his responsible girl. For one evening, I felt like the daughter they'd always wanted me to be. Looking back, I can see how carefully they'd orchestrated the whole thing. The minor car accident was real, but Madison had caused it deliberately, backing into another car in a parking lot to create a believable crisis. The lawsuit threat was fabricated, supported by fake legal documents that Kevin, the insurance agent, had helped them create. Even the paperwork I signed wasn't what they claimed it was. Instead of temporary management transfer, I'd signed forms that gave Madison complete control over my policy, including the ability to change beneficiaries and file claims. But I didn't know any of that yet. For the next 2 months, life continued. Normally, I went to work, contributed to household expenses, and tried to rebuild the relationship with my family that had felt strained for so long. Madison seemed happier, less stressed about money, and even started talking about taking some business courses at the community college. Dad picked up a few construction jobs here and there, and Mom started planning a small vacation for the summer. Everything felt stable until the night I went to bed in my own room and woke up 18 hours later, in a hospital bed 300 miles away. The memories of that night are still fragmented, like trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. I remember having dinner with the family, nothing unusual. I remember feeling tired, more exhausted than normal, but I attributed it to a busy week at work. I remember going to bed around 10:30, setting my alarm for the usual time. And then, I remember nothing until I opened my eyes to fluorescent lights and the steady beeping of medical equipment. The nurse who first spoke to me was named Jennifer, and she had the kind of gentle voice that people use when they're about to deliver devastating news. She explained that I'd been in a car accident, that my car had gone off a mountain road about 2 hours outside Phoenix. A passing motorist had seen the headlights in the ravine and called for help. I'd been unconscious for nearly a day, suffering from a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a fractured wrist. What confused everyone, including me, was that nobody could explain what I'd been doing on that particular road. It wasn't on any route I normally drove, not a road that led anywhere I had reason to be. My car had been found with my purse, my phone, and my work badge, but no explanation for why I'd been driving through the mountains at midnight on a Wednesday. The police report noted that there were no skid marks, no signs that I'd tried to brake or steer away from the guardrail. I told everyone that I didn't remember leaving the house. I didn't remember getting in my car or deciding to go for a drive. The last clear memory I had was brushing my teeth and getting into bed. The doctors said that kind of memory loss was normal with head injuries, that the memories might come back gradually or might be gone forever. They were more concerned with monitoring my brain function and making sure there wasn't any internal bleeding. My family arrived at the hospital the next morning, and their performance was flawless. Mom cried and held my hand, telling me how worried they'd been when they discovered I wasn't in my room. Dad looked haggard and stressed, like he'd been up all night pacing hospital corridors. Madison was perfectly distraught, her eyes red from crying, her voice shaky as she explained how she'd called my phone dozens of times when I didn't answer. They had a story ready for why they hadn't noticed I was gone until morning. Madison said she'd assumed I'd left early for work, since I sometimes went in before normal hours to catch up on projects. Mom said she'd been taking new sleep medication that made her groggy, so she hadn't heard anything during the night. Dad claimed he'd fallen asleep on the couch watching television and hadn't realized anything was wrong until Madison mentioned that my car wasn't in the driveway. Everything they said sounded reasonable, the kind of innocent miscommunication that happens in busy families. But something felt wrong in a way I couldn't identify. It was like walking into a room and sensing that people had just stopped talking about you, or finding furniture moved slightly from where you remembered leaving it. Nothing dramatic, just an undercurrent of something that didn't quite fit. The eye. Insurance investigator showed up on my 3rd day in the hospital. Patricia Williams was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made you want to tell her the truth, even when you didn't know what the truth was. She introduced herself as someone who handled unusual claims for the insurance company, and she had some questions about my accident. What made her suspicious, she explained, was the timing. I'd taken out a substantial life insurance policy just weeks before an accident that easily could have killed me. The circumstances were unusual enough that the company wanted to make sure everything was legitimate before processing any claims. She wasn't accusing anyone of anything, she assured me, just doing her due diligence. I told her the same thing I'd told everyone else. I didn't remember leaving the house, didn't remember driving to the mountains, didn't remember anything about the accident itself. Patricia nodded and took notes, but I could see her thinking, processing information in ways that made me nervous. She asked about my family, about any stress or changes in my life, about my financial situation. All routine questions, she said. The kind of thing they asked in any case like this. But then she asked something that stopped me cold. She wanted to know if I was aware that someone had filed a preliminary death claim on my life insurance policy while I was unconscious in the hospital. Not a full claim, she clarified, just paperwork that would speed up the process if I didn't recover. Perfectly legal, she said. The kind of thing families sometimes do to prepare for the worst-case scenario. I stared at her, feeling like the hospital room had suddenly tilted sideways. Madison had filed paperwork assuming I would die. While I was unconscious, while doctors were monitoring my brain function and checking for internal bleeding, my sister had been at an insurance office filling out forms that would give her access to my life insurance money. Patricia watched my face carefully as she delivered this information, and I could see her noting my genuine shock and confusion. That's when she showed me the other paperwork, the documents that revealed how extensively my family had manipulated the insurance policy, without my knowledge. The forged signatures, the changed beneficiaries, the management transfer that gave Madison far more control than I'd ever intended to sign over. She spread it all out on the hospital bed table like evidence in a criminal case, which I was beginning to realize it might actually be. The room felt like it was spinning, and not just from the concussion. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about that night, about the accident itself, was crumbling like a house built on sand. Patricia kept talking, explaining about fraud investigations and police reports, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. All I could think about was Madison crying in the kitchen, thanking me for being such an amazing sister, while she planned to kill me for money. Patricia left her card and told me to call her when I was ready to talk more. She also mentioned, almost casually, that the police had found something interesting when they examined my car more thoroughly. There were traces of sedatives in my water bottle, the one I kept beside my bed and drank from every night before going to sleep. Not enough to be fatal, but enough to make someone drowsy and disoriented. Enough to make someone easier to manipulate into getting into a car and driving, somewhere they'd never intended to go. I spent that night staring at the hospital ceiling, trying to piece together what had really happened. The sedatives explained why I'd felt so exhausted that evening, why I'd gone to bed earlier than usual. But I still couldn't remember anything about leaving the house or getting in the car. The doctor said that sometimes trauma victims block out memories that are too painful to process, that my mind might be protecting me from remembering something terrible. It wasn't until 2 days later, when a different nurse mentioned that my family had seemed unusually calm when they first arrived at the hospital, that another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Most families, she said, were frantic when they got calls about loved ones in serious accidents. They arrived disheveled and panicked, asking dozens of questions about treatment and prognosis. But my family had seemed prepared, like they'd already processed the shock and moved into practical mode. Because they had. They'd known I was going to have an accident because they'd planned it. The sedatives were just the first step, making me compliant enough to manipulate. Someone, probably Madison, had helped me into my car while I was too drugged to understand what was happening. They'd driven me to that mountain road, positioned the car at the guardrail, and sent it over the edge. The only reason I was alive was because the car had gotten caught on a tree instead of plummeting all the way to the bottom of the ravine. My family had tried to murder me, and when that failed, Madison had immediately started the paperwork to claim my life insurance money anyway. probably hoping I'd die from my injuries before anyone asked too many questions. The thought was so monstrous, so far beyond anything I could have imagined, that part of me still wanted to believe there was some other explanation. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Patricia Williams was very good at her job. Over the next few days, she pieced together a timeline that painted a clear picture of premeditation. The insurance policy had been Madison's idea from the beginning, not a spontaneous decision about financial responsibility. Kevin, the insurance agent, had been part of the scheme, helping them manipulate policy terms and forge documents. Even the minor car accident that had justified the management transfer had been staged specifically to give Madison control over my policy. The most chilling detail was how long they'd been planning it. Patricia found evidence that Madison had been researching life insurance fraud for months before she'd even mentioned getting policies. She'd studied cases, learned about investigation procedures, and carefully crafted a plan designed to look like a tragic accident. The sedatives, the remote location, even the timing of the preliminary claim filing, everything had been calculated to maximize the chances of success while minimizing the risk of getting caught. I was released from the hospital on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd woken up there. Patricia had arranged for me to stay in a safe house temporarily, a small apartment across town where my family couldn't find me while the investigation continued. She'd also frozen my bank accounts and credit cards, since Madison had access to those as well, and provided me with new identification and a small amount of cash to cover immediate expenses. The safe house was sparse but clean, furnished with the kind of generic furniture you'd find in any extended-stay hotel. There was a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a television that got basic cable. The refrigerator was stocked with essentials, and there was a phone I could use to contact Patricia or the police if necessary. It felt like a witness protection setup, which in many ways it was. I spent the first 3 days in that apartment trying to process what had happened to me. The physical injuries were healing, but the emotional damage felt insurmountable. How do you wrap your mind around the fact that your parents and sister tried to kill you for money? How do you reconcile years of family memories with the knowledge that the people who raised you saw you as nothing more than a financial opportunity? The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about my life. Had they ever loved me, or had I always just been useful to them? How long had they been planning this? What would have happened if the car accident had been successful? Would they have mourned me at my funeral while secretly celebrating the insurance payout? Patricia visited me every few days to update me on the investigation and check on my emotional state. She'd seen cases like this before, she told me, though usually the victims didn't survive to tell their stories. Financial abuse within families was more common than people realized, and it often escalated to physical danger when the stakes were high enough. She recommended that I start seeing a counselor who specialized in trauma and family violence, someone who could help me process what had happened and develop strategies for moving forward. But first, she said, I needed to decide what I wanted to do about my family. The evidence was strong enough to support criminal charges for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. If I was willing to testify, the prosecutor was confident, they could get convictions. But pursuing criminal charges would mean months or years of legal proceedings, media attention, and constant reminders of what they'd tried to do to me. The alternative was to disappear. Patricia could help me establish a new identity in a different state, far enough away that my family would never find me. I could start over completely, build a new life without the constant fear that they might try again. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be safe, and sometimes safety was more important than justice. I spent hours walking around that safe house apartment, weighing my options and trying to imagine either future. Could I really sit in a courtroom and watch my parents and sister be sentenced for trying to kill me? Could I handle the media attention that would inevitably come with a case like this? But could I also live with myself if I let them get away with it, knowing they might try the same thing with someone else? The decision was made for me when Patricia called on Friday evening with news that changed everything. Madison had been arrested that afternoon for attempting to file a fraudulent insurance claim. She'd gone to Kevin's office to complete the paperwork for my supposed death, despite the fact that I was obviously still alive and recovering. The arrest had been caught on security cameras, and Madison's reaction when confronted with evidence of the fraud had been telling. Instead of denying everything or demanding a lawyer, Madison had broken down and confessed to the entire scheme. She'd told police about the sedatives, about driving me to the mountain road, about planning the accident. For months, she'd even implicated our parents, describing how Dad had helped research the location and Mom had prepared the sedatives. It was a complete confession, recorded and witnessed, that would make prosecution a straightforward matter. But Madison had also said something else, something that made my blood run cold. She'd told the investigator that this wasn't the first time they'd considered killing me for money. There had been other plans, other schemes that they'd abandoned because the risk was too high, or the potential payout wasn't worth it. She described years of viewing me as a financial resource rather than a family member, of calculating my worth, in terms of what my death could provide for them. That night, alone in the safe house apartment, I made the decision that would change the course of my life forever. I wasn't going to pursue criminal charges, not because I forgave them or wanted to protect them, but because I refused to spend another minute of my life dealing with their toxicity. I was going to disappear, completely and permanently, and build a life they could never touch. Patricia helped me understand the legal implications of that choice. Without my testimony, the case against my parents would be much weaker, relying mainly on Madison's confession and the documentary evidence of fraud. Madison herself would likely face serious charges, but Robert and Linda might escape with lesser penalties or plea bargains. The insurance company would recover its money, but the criminal justice system might not deliver the kind of consequences that match the severity of their crimes. I told Patricia I understood all of that, but my priority was my own safety and peace of mind. I wanted to disappear so thoroughly that my family would never be able to find me, never be able to hurt me again. I wanted to create a life where the attempted murder would eventually feel like something that happened to someone else, a terrible story I'd heard rather than a trauma I'd lived through. And that's exactly what I did. With Patricia's help, I legally changed my name, obtained new identification, and moved to a small town in North Carolina where nobody knew my history or my family. I left behind everything that connected me to my old life, my job, my apartment, my friends, even my car. I took only the clothes I'd been wearing when I left the hospital and the small amount of cash Patricia had provided. The transformation wasn't just external. Over the following months, I rebuilt myself from the ground up, discovering who I was when I wasn't trying to earn my family's approval or meet their expectations. I found work, made new friends, and slowly learned to trust people again. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the most liberating. But this isn't a story about victimhood or running away. This is a story about what happened when I finally stopped running and started fighting back. Because 18 months after I disappeared from that hospital in Phoenix, my family found me. And this time, I was ready for them. The drive to North Carolina took me 3 days, not because of the distance, but because I kept stopping to make sure I wasn't being followed. Patricia had given me detailed instructions about how to disappear properly, and the first rule was never to travel in straight lines. I drove through Texas, stopped overnight in Louisiana, took a detour through Tennessee, and finally crossed into North Carolina through the back roads of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I chose Asheville because it was the kind of place where people came to reinvent themselves. Artists, writers, people escaping corporate jobs or toxic relationships, folks who valued privacy and didn't ask too many questions about your past. The town was big enough to disappear in, but small enough to feel safe, surrounded by mountains that felt like natural barriers between me and the world I was leaving behind. My new identity was simple and unremarkable. Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, originally from Oregon. Patricia had crafted a believable backstory about a quiet childhood, state college, a few years working in administration before deciding to relocate for a fresh start. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable, just the kind of ordinary background that wouldn't invite follow-up questions or deeper investigation. The apartment I rented was on the second floor of a converted Victorian house in the Montford neighborhood, about 10 minutes from downtown. It was furnished with someone else's cast-off furniture, mismatched but comfortable, with windows that looked out over tree-lined streets and front porches where people actually sat in rocking chairs. The rent was reasonable. The landlady was friendly but not intrusive. And most importantly, it was a cash-only arrangement that wouldn't create any paper trail. For the first few weeks, I barely left the apartment except to buy groceries and explore the neighborhood. I was still healing physically from the accident, but more than that, I was trying to figure out how to be a person who wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder. Every unexpected noise made me jump. Every knock on the door sent my heart racing. I'd developed the kind of hypervigilance that comes from knowing your own family tried to kill you, and it took time to convince my nervous system that I was actually safe. The nightmares were the worst part. Not about the accident itself, since I still couldn't remember most of that night, but about the moments leading up to it. I'd dream about drinking water that tasted strange, about feeling dizzy and confused, about Madison's voice guiding me somewhere I didn't want to go. I'd wake up gasping, checking the locks on my doors, sometimes pacing the apartment until dawn, just to convince myself I was really alone and really safe. But slowly, day by day, I started to rebuild. I found work at a small nonprofit that helped people navigate health insurance claims, ironic given my own recent experience with insurance fraud. The job paid enough to cover my basic expenses, and the work felt meaningful in a way my old accounting position never had. I was helping people fight bureaucracy instead of feeding it, using my skills to level playing fields instead of just balancing books. My boss, Margaret, was a woman in her 60s who'd started the organization after her own battle with insurance companies when her husband was dying of cancer. She had the kind of fierce compassion that comes from personal experience with systemic injustice, and she never asked probing questions about my background or why someone with my qualifications was willing to work for nonprofit wages. She just appreciated that I could navigate complex paperwork and explain it to people in plain English. The work gave me structure and purpose, but it also exposed me to stories that felt uncomfortably familiar. People whose families had stolen their identities for financial gain. Elderly clients whose children had manipulated them into signing over assets. Victims of domestic violence who'd escaped but found their abusers had destroyed their credit and emptied their bank accounts. I started to understand that what happened, to me, wasn't unique, just more extreme than most. In the evenings, I explored Asheville's downtown, gradually becoming more comfortable with being seen in public. The city had a vibrant art scene, with galleries and music venues and restaurants that attracted both locals and tourists. I started eating dinner at small cafes instead of hiding in my apartment, cautiously engaging in brief conversations with servers and shopkeepers who treated me like just another transplant finding her footing in a new place. After about 2 months, I discovered the Asheville Community Wellness Center, a converted warehouse that offered everything from yoga classes to support groups to job training programs. The building buzzed with the kind of positive energy that comes from people working on themselves, individually and collectively. I started attending meditation sessions on Tuesday evenings, sitting in circles with strangers who were also trying to heal from various traumas and transitions. The meditation instructor, David, was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who'd found mindfulness after his own experience with PTSD from military service. He had a way of creating space for people to be broken without trying to fix them, to sit with difficult emotions without rushing toward solutions. The classes were drop-in, no registration required, no personal information shared unless you wanted to. It was exactly the kind of anonymous healing I needed. During those early months in Asheville, I spoke to Patricia every few weeks to get updates on the legal proceedings back in Phoenix. Madison had been charged with attempted murder, insurance fraud, and conspiracy, and had accepted a plea deal that would send her to prison for 8 to 12 years. Robert and Linda had been charged with conspiracy and accessory to attempted murder, but without my testimony, the case against them was weaker. They'd accepted plea bargains that included restitution to the insurance company and probation, but no jail time. Part of me was frustrated that my parents had escaped serious consequences, but a larger part of me was relieved that I wouldn't have to relive the trauma in a courtroom. Patricia understood my choice and assured me that my safety was more important than the satisfaction of seeing them punished. She also told me that the insurance company had flagged their names in databases that would prevent them from taking out policies on anyone else, effectively ending their ability to repeat this kind of scheme. The most important update came about 4 months after I'd left Phoenix. Patricia called to tell me that my family believed I was dead. Madison had apparently convinced Robert and Linda that I must have died from my injuries after leaving the hospital, probably from complications they hadn't detected. She'd told them I'd probably crawled away somewhere to die alone, too ashamed to face them after surviving their murder attempt. It was a morbid fiction, but it meant they weren't looking for me, which gave me the psychological space I needed to fully commit to my new life. With that knowledge, I started making deeper connections in Asheville. I joined a hiking group that explored the Appalachian trails every weekend, slowly rebuilding the physical strength I'd lost during my recovery. I started volunteering at the local food bank on Saturday mornings, working alongside other people who understood that community service was often as much about healing yourself as helping others. I even adopted a cat from the animal shelter, a small tabby named Luna, who seemed to understand that we were both starting over. The hiking group became especially important to my healing process. There was something about being in the mountains, surrounded by trees and streams and wildlife, that made me feel connected to something larger than my own trauma. The physical challenge of climbing trails and the mental focus required for navigation gave me a way to process emotions that were too big for words. And the people I hiked with were the kind of folks who understood that sometimes silence was more healing than conversation. My favorite hiking companion was an older woman named Patricia, coincidentally sharing a name with the insurance investigator who'd saved my life. This Patricia was a retired social worker who'd moved to Asheville after her husband died, looking for a place where she could grieve without well-meaning friends constantly trying to cheer her up. She had the kind of wisdom that comes from years of helping people through their worst moments, and she never pushed me to share more than I was ready to reveal. We'd often hike for hours without talking, just moving through the forest with the kind of companionship that doesn't require words. But sometimes, when we'd stop to rest beside a creek or take in a view from a mountain ridge, she'd share insights about healing that felt like gifts. She talked about how trauma could actually strengthen you if you let it, how surviving something terrible could teach you exactly how much you could endure. She never asked about my specific trauma, but she seemed to understand that I was carrying something heavy. The meditation sessions also became a cornerstone of my new life. David's approach focused on observing thoughts and emotions without judgment, learning to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. For someone who'd spent months either dissociating from reality or being consumed by hypervigilance, the practice of simply being present was revolutionary. I learned to notice when my mind started spinning stories about danger that wasn't really there, and to return my attention to my breath and the immediate moment. One evening, about 6 months after I'd arrived in Asheville, David approached me after class with a proposition. The Wellness Center was looking for someone to help coordinate their support group programs, matching people with appropriate groups and helping facilitators manage logistics. It wasn't a paid position, but it would give me deeper access to the healing community and a chance to use my organizational skills for something meaningful. More importantly, he said, he thought I had the kind of presence that would help other people feel safe to share their stories. I accepted the volunteer position partly because I wanted to give back to the community that had helped heal me, but also because I was curious about other people's survival stories. Working with the support groups exposed me to an incredible range of human resilience. Veterans dealing with PTSD, survivors of domestic violence, people recovering from addiction, individuals processing grief from loss of loved ones. Each group had its own culture and rhythm, but they all shared the common element of people helping each other heal through shared vulnerability. The domestic violence support group was particularly meaningful to me, even though my experience didn't fit the typical pattern of intimate partner abuse. Many of the women in that group had stories about family members who'd financially exploited them, who'd used emotional manipulation to maintain control, who'd escalated to physical violence when other tactics failed. Their stories helped me understand that what my family did to me was part of a larger pattern of abuse, not an isolated incident of greed or desperation. Through my work with the support groups, I also learned about the legal resources available to abuse survivors. There were attorneys who specialized in helping victims recover stolen assets, organizations that helped people establish new identities safely, and databases that tracked financial predators to prevent them from targeting new victims. I started to understand that disappearing wasn't my only option, that there were ways to fight back that didn't require me to return to Phoenix or relive the trauma in court. By my first winter in Asheville, I'd established a routine that felt sustainable and healing. I worked at the nonprofit during the day, coordinated support groups in the evenings, hiked on weekends, and meditated whenever the anxiety threatened to overwhelm me. I'd made genuine friendships with people who knew me as Sarah Mitchell and had no reason to question that identity. I was sleeping through the night most of the time, and the hypervigilance was fading into a more manageable awareness of my surroundings. But I was also starting to feel restless in a way that surprised me. The life I'd built in Asheville was safe and healing, but it was also constrained by the need to hide from my past. I couldn't take jobs that required background checks. I couldn't develop relationships deep enough to involve meeting families or sharing histories. I couldn't travel freely or use social media or do dozens of other things that normal people took for granted. My safety came at the cost of authentic connection, and I was beginning to wonder if that trade-off was sustainable long-term. The turning point came during a particularly powerful session of the domestic violence support group. One of the women, Elena, was talking about her decision to testify against her ex-husband despite the risks involved. She'd been terrified of retaliation, of reliving the trauma in court, of having her credibility questioned by defense attorneys. But she'd realized that staying silent meant he would almost certainly abuse other women, and she couldn't live with that knowledge. Elena described the process of testifying as one of the most difficult but empowering experiences of her life. She'd expected to feel victimized all over again, but instead she'd felt strong. She'd looked her abuser in the eye and told the truth about what he'd done, and the jury had believed her. He'd been convicted and sentenced to prison, but more importantly, she'd reclaimed her voice and her power. She'd stopped being afraid of him because she'd proven to herself that she could face him and survive. Listening to Elena's story made me realize that I'd been living in a kind of prison myself, one built from fear and secrecy. I'd escaped the immediate danger and I'd healed from the trauma, but I hadn't truly reclaimed my power. My family had tried to kill me and mostly gotten away with it, while I'd spent over a year hiding and pretending to be someone else. They were living their lives freely while I was constrained by the need to stay invisible. That night, I called Patricia Williams for the first time in months. She was surprised to hear from me, but pleased to know I was doing well. When I told her I was considering coming forward to testify after all, she was quiet for a long moment, before asking what had changed my mind. I explained about Elena's story, about my growing understanding that healing wasn't just about personal safety, but about reclaiming agency and voice. Patricia told me that the legal situation had evolved, During my absence, Madison was serving her sentence and had apparently become a model prisoner, participating in therapy programs and expressing genuine remorse for what she'd done. Robert and Linda had completed their probation requirements but had violated the terms of their plea agreement by attempting to take out insurance policies on each other using false information. The insurance fraud unit was building a new case against them, and my testimony would be crucial for securing convictions. More importantly, Patricia said, there was growing interest in my case from journalists and advocacy organizations. Financial. Abuse within families was becoming a recognized form of domestic violence, and my story could help raise awareness and potentially prevent similar crimes. If I was willing to go public, there were resources available to protect my safety while allowing me to speak out about what had happened. The conversation with Patricia planted a seed that grew stronger over the following weeks. I started researching other survivors who'd chosen to speak publicly about their experiences with family violence. I read articles about the power of victim impact statements, about the healing that could come from transforming trauma into advocacy. I talked to David about the spiritual aspects of moving from victim to survivor to thriver, about what it meant to alchemize suffering into service. The decision crystallized during a meditation session on a snowy February evening. We were practicing loving kindness meditation, sending compassion first to ourselves, then to loved ones, then to neutral people, and finally to those who had harmed us. When I got to the part about sending loving kindness to my family, something shifted inside me. I realized that I could forgive them not because they deserved it, but because carrying anger was exhausting and forgiveness would free me to use my energy for more constructive purposes. But forgiveness didn't mean I had to protect them from the consequences of their actions. In fact, true forgiveness might require holding them accountable, helping them face the full reality of what they'd done so they could begin their own healing process. And speaking out about my experience might help other people recognize the warning signs of financial abuse before it escalated to physical danger. That night, I made the decision that would change everything once again. I was going to return to Phoenix, not as a victim hiding from her family, but as a survivor ready to reclaim her story and her power. I was going to testify against my parents, work with journalists to tell my story publicly, and use my experience to help protect other potential victims. The process of preparing to leave Asheville was both exciting and terrifying. I'd spent over a year building a life as Sarah Mitchell, and now I had to figure out how to become Stacey again without losing everything I'd learned and gained during my time in hiding. I talked to Margaret about taking a leave of absence from my job, with the possibility of returning if things didn't work out in Phoenix. I arranged for Luna to stay with Patricia the hiker, who'd grown attached to both of us during our weekend adventures. Most importantly, I worked with the support groups to create resources they could use in my absence. I compiled contact lists for local attorneys and advocates, created intake forms for new members, and trained other volunteers to handle the coordination tasks I'd been managing. Leaving the community that had helped heal me was painful, but I knew I was carrying their strength and wisdom with me as I prepared to face my family and my past. The night before I left Asheville, the Wellness Center held a going-away gathering that they called a blessing circle. About 30 people showed up, including folks from the hiking group, the meditation sessions, the support groups, and the nonprofit where I worked. We sat in a large circle in the main room of the center, and people took turns sharing what my presence had meant to them and offering wishes for my journey ahead. David spoke about witnessing my transformation from someone who could barely sit, still during meditation, to someone who radiated calm strength. Patricia the hiker talked about our silent conversations in the mountains and how my quiet presence had helped her process her own grief. Elena from the domestic violence group thanked me for listening to her story about testifying and said she was proud of me for finding the courage to reclaim my own voice. As I listened to people describe their perception of me, I realized how much I'd changed during my time in Asheville. I'd arrived as Stacey, A woman so broken by betrayal that she couldn't trust her own family, so afraid that she'd been willing to disappear completely rather than fight for justice. I was leaving as someone who'd integrated that trauma into a deeper understanding of human resilience, someone who'd learned that healing wasn't just about avoiding further harm, but about transforming suffering into strength and service. The blessing circle ended with everyone placing their hands on my shoulders and offering a collective wish for protection, courage, and success in whatever lay ahead. I felt surrounded by love in a way I'd never experienced with my biological family, held by a community that had chosen to care about me without expecting anything in return. Whatever happened in Phoenix, I knew I'd always have this experience of unconditional support to draw upon. The drive back to Arizona took 2 days, and this time I drove straight through, no longer afraid of being followed or discovered. I was returning to Phoenix not as a fugitive or a victim, but as someone who'd done the hard work of healing and was ready to face whatever consequences that choice might bring. Patricia Williams met me at a hotel near the airport, and seeing her again felt like coming full circle. She looked older than I remembered, with more gray in her hair and deeper lines around her eyes. But her handshake was firm and her smile was genuine as she welcomed me back to Arizona. She'd spent the past year building an airtight case against Robert and Linda, and my testimony would be the final piece needed to ensure convictions. More importantly, she'd arranged for security measures that would keep me safe throughout the legal proceedings and beyond. As we sat in the hotel restaurant, reviewing the timeline for the trial, Patricia asked me what had changed my mind about testifying. I told her about Elena's story, about the support community in Asheville, about my growing understanding that real healing required reclaiming agency and voice. But more than anything, I said, I'd realized that staying hidden meant my family had won. They'd tried to kill me and mostly gotten away with it, while I'd spent over a year living like a fugitive from my own life. Patricia nodded and said something that crystallized my feelings perfectly. She said that trauma could either make you smaller or larger, could either teach you to hide from the world or show you exactly how much strength you possessed. The fact that I'd chosen to return and fight meant I'd integrated the trauma in a way that made me stronger rather than more fearful. And that strength, she said, was exactly what would make my testimony so powerful. That night, alone in the hotel room, I felt the weight of the decision I'd made. Tomorrow I would begin the process of confronting my family and telling my story, publicly. There would be media attention, legal proceedings, and probably attempts at retaliation or manipulation. But I was no longer the woman who'd been drugged and left for dead on a mountain road. I was someone who'd rebuilt herself from scratch, who'd learned to find strength in vulnerability and power in truth-telling. I was ready to face whatever came next, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. My family had tried to erase me, but instead they'd forced me to discover exactly who I was beneath all their expectations and manipulations. And that person, I'd learned, was much stronger than they'd ever imagined. The courthouse steps felt different under my feet than I'd imagined they would. For months, I'd pictured this moment as something dramatic and cinematic, but standing there on a Tuesday morning in downtown Phoenix, surrounded by the familiar desert heat and the smell of creosote bushes, it felt strangely ordinary. Just another government building where people came to resolve disputes and seek justice, nothing more or less than that. Patricia Williams walked beside me, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 18 months of investigation, documentation, and preparation. She'd warned me that seeing my parents again would be difficult, but she'd also prepared me for the practical aspects of testimony, the way courtrooms worked, and what to expect from the defense attorneys. What she couldn't prepare me for was the emotional complexity of facing people who'd tried to kill me while still carrying decades of complicated family history. The security measures were more extensive than I'd expected. There were metal detectors, bag searches, and a deputy who'd been specifically assigned to monitor my safety throughout the proceedings. Patricia had explained that threats against witnesses in family violence cases were common, especially when substantial money was involved, but the precautions still felt surreal. I was entering a building where armed guards were protecting me from my own parents. Inside the courthouse, everything moved with the efficient indifference of bureaucracy. Clerks shuffled papers, attorneys huddled in whispered conversations, and defendants sat beside their lawyers with expressions ranging from defiant to resigned. The building hummed with the quiet desperation of people whose lives had been reduced to legal proceedings, where years of relationships and choices would be distilled into evidence and verdict. The prosecution team had arranged for me to meet with them in a small conference room before the hearing began. District Attorney Jennifer Martinez was a woman in her early 40s, with the kind of focused intensity that comes from years of fighting for victims who couldn't fight for themselves. She'd built her career on complex fraud cases and had a reputation for being thorough, compassionate, and absolutely relentless when it came to holding perpetrators accountable. Jennifer reviewed my testimony with me one final time, walking through the timeline of events and the questions I could expect from both the prosecution and defense. She warned me that Robert and Linda's attorney would try to portray me as an ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her family and was now seeking revenge through false accusations. They'd probably question my memory of events, suggest that my disappearance proved I was mentally unstable, and try to paint Madison as the real mastermind while positioning my parents as unwitting accomplices. The strategy didn't surprise me. During my time in Asheville, I'd researched other cases involving family violence and financial abuse, and victim blaming was a standard defense tactic. The goal was to make me seem unreliable or vindictive, to suggest that my parents were just desperate people who'd made poor decisions rather than calculating predators who'd planned my murder for months. What the defense couldn't know was how much I'd changed during my time away, how much strength I'd gained from community and healing work. When it was time to enter the courtroom, I felt my heart rate increase, but my mind remained clear. The meditation. Practices from Asheville had taught me to observe anxiety without being overwhelmed by it, to stay present even when my nervous system was activated. I could feel the familiar symptoms of stress, but I also felt grounded in my body and connected to my purpose in being there. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly institutional feel. About 30 people filled the gallery, including journalists, court personnel, and a few faces I didn't recognize but assumed were supporters of my parents. Robert and Linda sat at the defense table with their attorney, both of them looking older and more worn down than I remembered. They didn't turn around when I entered, but I could see Linda's shoulders tense and Robert's hands clench into fists. Judge Margaret Chen called the hearing to order with the kind of calm authority that suggested she'd presided over thousands of similar proceedings. She explained the charges against Robert and Linda: conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, accessory to attempted murder, and financial exploitation of a family member. She outlined the evidence that would be presented and reminded everyone that these were serious felonies with potential sentences of 15 to 25 years in prison. Jennifer Martinez delivered her opening statement with the precision of someone who'd memorized every detail of the case. She described the months of planning that went into the insurance fraud scheme, the deliberate manipulation of family relationships to gain access to my policy, and the escalation to attempted murder when they realized how much money was at stake. She painted a picture of systematic predation that went far beyond desperate people making bad choices. The defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Michael Harrison, countered with exactly the strategy Jennifer had predicted. He portrayed Robert and Linda as loving parents who'd been manipulated by their troubled younger daughter Madison into participating in a scheme they didn't fully understand. He suggested that I was an unreliable narrator who'd disappeared for over a year and was now seeking revenge against parents who'd always supported me financially and emotionally. What struck me most about Harrison's opening statement was how completely it erased the reality of what had happened to me. In his version of events, I wasn't a victim of attempted murder, but a vindictive daughter. My parents weren't predators, but victims of their own daughter's manipulation. The extensive planning and premeditation became confused elderly people who didn't understand what they were signing. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, and I could see how effective it might be with jurors who wanted to believe that parents couldn't really try to kill their children for money. The prosecution began by calling Patricia Williams to the stand. She testified about the insurance investigation, walking through the timeline of policy changes, forged signatures, and fraudulent beneficiary designations. She explained how the EC evidence pointed to months of planning and coordination between all three family members, with specific roles assigned to each person in executing the scheme. Her testimony was methodical and devastating, laying out a paper trail that would be difficult for the defense to explain away. During cross-examination, Harrison tried to suggest that Patricia was biased against my parents because of her professional relationship with the insurance company. He questioned whether she'd adequately investigated alternative explanations for the evidence, whether she'd considered that Madison might have acted alone in forging documents and manipulating family members. Patricia remained calm and professional, methodically explaining why the evidence pointed to conspiracy rather than individual action. The second day of testimony focused on the medical evidence from my accident and recovery. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency room physician who'd treated me, testified about the extent of my injuries and the unusual circumstances surrounding my arrival at the hospital. She explained that the pattern of injuries was consistent with a high-speed collision, but that my blood work had shown traces of sedatives that weren't consistent with any medications I'd been prescribed. Dr. Chen also testified about my family's behavior during my hospitalization, noting that they'd seemed unusually calm and prepared for someone whose daughter had been in a life-threatening accident. She'd found it strange that they'd asked specific questions about insurance claims and death certificates while I was still unconscious and fighting for my life. Her testimony painted a picture of people who were more concerned with financial logistics than medical outcomes. The toxicology expert who'd analyzed my blood samples provided crucial testimony about the sedatives found in my system. Dr. James Rodriguez explained that the combination of drugs would have made me drowsy, confused, and highly suggestible without rendering me completely unconscious. It was exactly the kind of chemical cocktail someone would use if they wanted to manipulate a person into compliance without leaving obvious evidence of drugging. During cross-examination, Harrison suggested that I might have taken the sedatives myself, either intentionally or by accident. Dr. Rodriguez calmly explained that the specific combination and dosage weren't consistent with either suicide attempt or accidental ingestion. The drugs had clearly been administered by someone with knowledge of their effects, and the timing suggested careful planning rather than impulsive action. On the third day, it was my turn to testify. Walking to the witness stand felt like crossing a bridge between my old life and whatever came next. I'd spent months preparing for this moment, but nothing could really prepare you for the surreal experience of telling a room full of strangers about the night your family tried to kill you. As I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth, I felt the weight of that oath in a way I'd never experienced before. Jennifer Martinez guided me through my testimony with the skill of someone who understood trauma and the difficulty of recounting painful experiences. She started with background information about my relationship with my family, the financial pressures they'd been facing, and the circumstances that led to taking out the life insurance policies. I explained how the insurance had been presented as a responsible financial decision, how I'd been gradually manipulated into signing over control of my policy, and how the fake car accident crisis had been used to justify the management transfer. Describing the night of the attempted murder was the most difficult part of my testimony. I had to admit that I still didn't remember everything that happened, that the combination of sedatives and head trauma had created gaps in my memory that might never be filled. But I could describe the feeling of being unusually tired that evening, the strange taste in my water, and the disorientation that had made me unusually compliant when Madison suggested I needed to go somewhere with her. What I could remember clearly was waking up in the hospital and gradually piecing together what had happened to me. I testified about Patricia Williams showing me the fraudulent insurance documents, about learning that someone had filed preliminary death claims while I was unconscious, about the growing realization that my family had planned and executed an attempt on my life. I described the emotional impact of that betrayal, the way it had shattered not just my sense of safety, but my understanding of who I was and where I belonged in the world. Jennifer asked me to describe my decision to disappear rather than immediately pursue criminal charges. I explained that I'd been terrified of my family, uncertain about my ability to survive the trauma of legal proceedings, and desperate to escape an environment where the people who were supposed to protect me had tried to kill me. I testified about the year and a half I'd spent rebuilding my life in North Carolina, the healing work I'd done, and the gradual process of regaining enough strength to seek justice. The cross-examination was as brutal as Jennifer had warned me it would be. Harrison immediately attacked my credibility, suggesting that my memory problems made me an unreliable witness. He questioned why I'd waited so long to come forward if I really believed my parents had tried to kill me. He suggested that my disappearance proved I was mentally unstable, that my testimony was motivated by a desire for revenge rather than a commitment to truth. Harrison also tried to portray my family relationships in a more positive light, asking about the financial support my parents had provided over the years, the times they'd helped me through difficult periods, and the family traditions we'd shared. He was trying to make it seem impossible that people who'd loved and supported me could also have tried to kill me, as if financial generosity canceled out attempted murder. The most painful part of cross-examination came when Harrison questioned my emotional responses during and after the trauma. He suggested that my calm demeanor during testimony proved I was either lying about the impact of events or had never really been in danger. He questioned why I hadn't cried more, why I hadn't seemed more afraid, why I'd been able to function well enough to build a new life in North Carolina if I'd really been as traumatized as I claimed. What Harrison didn't understand, and what I tried to explain, was that trauma responses are highly individual and that healing doesn't look the same for everyone. Some people become hysterical, some people shut down completely, and some people, like me, develop a kind of focused calm that allows them to function despite carrying enormous pain. My ability to rebuild my life wasn't evidence that nothing bad had happened to me. It was evidence of the human capacity for resilience and the power of community support in healing process. I also testified about the specific ways my family had violated my trust and autonomy over the years, patterns of behavior that I'd only been able to recognize and name after working with domestic violence survivors in Asheville. The insurance fraud wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of decades of financial manipulation, emotional control, and systematic undermining of my independence and self-worth. When Harrison suggested that I was just an ungrateful daughter, seeking revenge against parents who'd always done their best for me, I felt something shift inside me. The meditation and therapy work I'd done in North Carolina had taught me to respond to gaslighting with calm clarity rather than defensive anger. I looked directly at the jury and explained that gratitude didn't require accepting abuse, that loving someone didn't mean tolerating attempts on your life, and that families who truly cared about each other didn't try to profit from murder. The prosecution concluded my testimony by asking me to describe what justice looked like to me. I explained that I didn't want revenge, but I did want accountability. I wanted my parents to face the full consequences of their actions so they couldn't hurt anyone else. And I wanted other families to understand that financial abuse could escalate to physical violence if left unchecked. Most importantly, I wanted to reclaim my voice and my story, to refuse to be silenced by shame or fear. After I stepped down from the witness stand, there was a brief recess during which Jennifer warned me that the defense would likely call character witnesses to testify about Robert and Linda's good reputation in the community. She explained that this was standard procedure in family violence cases, where defendants often had long histories of appearing normal and respectable to outsiders, while engaging in abusive behavior behind closed doors. The character witnesses were exactly what Jennifer had predicted. Neighbors who described Robert and Linda as helpful and generous, co-workers who talked about their dedication to family, and family friends who couldn't believe they were capable of the crimes they'd been charged with. One after another, people took the stand to describe my parents as loving, responsible people who'd raised their daughters well and would never hurt anyone. What struck me about these testimonies was how they perfectly illustrated the public face that many abusers maintain while engaging in private violence. Robert and Linda had been skilled at presenting themselves as devoted parents and community members, while simultaneously planning their daughter's murder for financial gain. The disconnect between public persona and private behavior wasn't unusual in family violence cases, but it was still jarring to hear people defend attempted murderers as upstanding citizens. The defense also called Dr. Angela Foster, a psychiatrist who'd never met me, but who testified about the unreliability of traumatic memories and the tendency for people with head injuries to confabulate or misremember events. Dr. Foster suggested that my testimony might be a combination of actual memories, suggestions from investigators, and false memories created by my brain's attempt to make sense of fragmented information. During cross-examination, Jennifer methodically dismantled Dr. Foster's testimony by pointing out that she'd never examined me, never reviewed my medical records, and was offering opinions based on hypothetical scenarios rather than actual evidence. Jennifer also established that the physical evidence of the insurance fraud existed independently of my memories, that the paper trail of planning and premeditation didn't rely on my testimony to prove criminal intent. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the defense called Madison to testify via video link from the correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. Harrison had apparently convinced her to recant parts of her original confession, suggesting that she'd exaggerated my parents' involvement to reduce her own culpability. Madison, looking thin and tired in her prison uniform, testified that she'd acted mostly alone in planning the insurance fraud and that Robert and Linda had been reluctant participants who didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to. During cross-examination, Jennifer played recordings of Madison's original confession, where she'd described in detail how our parents had helped research locations for the staged accident, how Linda had prepared the sedatives, and how Robert had driven the getaway car. The contrast between Madison's current testimony and her earlier statements was stark, and Jennifer methodically demonstrated how Madison's new version of events contradicted physical evidence and witness testimony. Jennifer also questioned Madison about her current living situation, revealing that Robert and Linda had been depositing money into her prison commissary account and had hired an attorney to help her appeal her conviction. The clear implication was that Madison's revised testimony was being bought and paid for by parents who were trying to reduce their own legal exposure, even while their older daughter was trying to hold them accountable for attempted murder. The closing arguments crystallized the two competing narratives that had emerged during the trial. Harrison portrayed Robert and Linda as elderly parents who'd been manipulated by their troubled younger daughter into participating in a scheme they didn't understand. People who deserved compassion rather than lengthy prison sentences. He suggested that I was an unreliable witness seeking revenge, that my memories were compromised by trauma, and that the evidence could be explained by Madison's solo actions rather than family conspiracy. Jennifer's closing argument was devastating in its clarity and precision. She walked through the evidence systematically, showing how each piece pointed to months of planning and coordination between all three family members. She explained how the timing of policy changes, the sophistication of the fraud scheme, and the careful execution of the staged accident all pointed to extensive collaboration rather than individual action. Most powerfully, Jennifer asked the jury to consider what kind of people would try to profit from their daughter's death. Who would drug their own child and stage a car accident for insurance money? She reminded them that family violence often escalated gradually, that financial abuse was a recognized form of domestic violence, and that the fact that Robert and Linda were my parents didn't make their crimes less serious or deserving of consequences. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days, which Jennifer told me was actually relatively quick for a case with this much evidence and complexity. During those days, I stayed in a hotel near the courthouse, surrounded by the same security, measures that had protected me throughout the trial. Patricia Williams checked on me regularly, and I spoke with David from the Asheville Wellness Center every evening, using the meditation techniques I'd learned to manage anxiety and stay grounded. On Thursday afternoon, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. Walking back into that courtroom felt different than it had during testimony, heavy with the weight of whatever decision 12 strangers had made about my family's fate. Robert and Linda sat at the defense table looking older and more frail than they had at the beginning of the trial, while Harrison shuffled through papers with the distracted air of someone preparing for disappointment. Judge Chen called the court to order and asked the jury foreman to read the verdicts. Robert James Mitchell, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of insurance fraud, guilty of accessory to attempted murder, guilty of financial exploitation of a family member. Linda Marie Mitchell, guilty on all the same charges. The words felt surreal even as I heard them, like something happening to someone else or in a movie rather than my actual life. The emotional impact hit me in waves rather than all at once. Relief that they'd been held accountable. Grief for the family relationships that could never be repaired. Anger at all the years of manipulation and control that had led to this moment. And underneath it all, a deep sense of validation that my perceptions had been accurate and my decision to seek justice had been right. Robert and Linda showed no visible emotion as the verdicts were read, sitting stone-faced beside their attorney, like they were watching someone else's trial. They didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence in the courtroom, didn't offer any gesture of remorse or accountability. Even in this moment of ultimate consequences, they maintained the emotional distance that had characterized their approach to me throughout my life. Judge Chen scheduled sentencing for the following week, but she remanded Robert and Linda to custody immediately rather than allowing them to remain free on bail. As deputies approached to escort them from the courtroom, Linda finally turned around and looked directly at me for the first time since I'd returned to Phoenix. Her expression wasn't apologetic or remorseful. It was furious, like I'd betrayed her by refusing to die quietly and conveniently. That look crystallized something important for me about the healing process and the difference between justice and reconciliation. I'd gotten justice in the form of legal accountability, but reconciliation was impossible with people who still saw me as the problem rather than themselves as perpetrators. Linda's angry stare reminded me that some relationships can't be repaired. That sometimes the healthiest choice is permanent separation rather than ongoing attempts at connection. Outside the courthouse, Jennifer Martinez held a brief press conference where she talked about the broader implications of the case for recognizing and prosecuting family violence. She emphasized that financial abuse was often a precursor to physical violence, that insurance fraud within families was more common than most people realized, and that victims needed support systems that understood the unique dynamics of abuse by family members. Several journalists asked me questions about my experience and my decision to speak publicly about what had happened. I explained that I hoped my story would help other people recognize warning signs of financial manipulation within families, and that victims of family violence needed to know that seeking justice was possible, even when the perpetrators were people they'd once loved and trusted. What I didn't mention in those interviews was how profoundly the trial had changed my understanding of my own story and identity. For over a year, I'd thought of myself primarily as a victim who'd escaped, someone who'd survived attempted murder and built a new life in hiding. But going through the legal process had transformed me into something different, a survivor who'd fought back, someone who'd refused to be silenced and had successfully held her abusers accountable. The difference between those identities was more significant than I'd expected. Being a victim who'd escaped meant living in fear of discovery, constantly looking over my shoulder, building my safety on secrecy and avoidance. being a survivor. Who'd fought back meant owning my story publicly, using my experience to help others, and building my safety on community support and legal protection rather than invisibility. That night, in my hotel room surrounded by flowers and cards from supporters I'd never met, I called the hiking Patricia in Asheville to tell her about the verdicts. She listened as I described the emotional complexity of seeing my parents convicted, the relief mixed with grief, the validation mixed with loss. She reminded me that healing wasn't linear, that justice didn't automatically erase trauma, and that I should expect to feel complicated emotions for a long time to come. We talked about my plans for returning to North Carolina, and I realized that I wasn't sure I wanted to go back to the life I'd built there. That life had been perfect for the person I'd been 18 months ago, someone who needed safety and community and gradual healing. But the person I was now, someone who'd faced her abusers in court and won, might need something different. I was starting to think about what it would mean to build a life based on authenticity and advocacy rather than hiding and healing. The sentencing hearing the following week was briefer and less dramatic than the trial itself. Judge Chen sentenced Robert and Linda each to 18 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 12 years. She explained that the sentences reflected both the severity of the crimes and the planning and premeditation involved, as well as the defendants' lack of remorse and refusal to accept responsibility for their actions. Judge Chen also ordered restitution to the insurance company and to me personally for medical expenses, lost wages, and the costs associated with establishing a new identity and rebuilding my life. The financial compensation wouldn't undo the trauma, but it would provide resources for continued therapy and the possibility of helping other survivors access similar support. As Robert and Linda were led away to begin their prison sentences, I felt a chapter of my life closing in a way that felt both final and surprisingly peaceful. They would spend the next 12 to 18 years in prison, long enough for me to build whatever life I wanted without fear of retaliation or interference. Long enough for them to potentially do the therapeutic work needed to understand and take responsibility for what they'd done, though I wasn't holding my breath for that kind of transformation. Walking out of the courthouse for the final time, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the insurance policy conversations began. Complete freedom to choose what came next. I could return to Asheville and resume the quiet life I'd built there, or I could stay in Arizona and rebuild connections to the place where I'd grown up. Or I could go somewhere entirely new and start fresh with all the wisdom I'd gained from both trauma and healing. For the first time in over 2 years, my choices weren't constrained by fear or the need to hide from dangerous people. I could use my real name, develop deep relationships, travel freely, and make long-term plans without worrying about discovery or safety. The people who'd tried to control and destroy me were locked away, and I was free to become whoever I wanted to be. That freedom felt both exhilarating and overwhelming, like standing at the edge of a vast landscape with infinite paths stretching out in every direction. After so many months of focused survival and then focused justice-seeking, I wasn't sure. I remembered how to live without a specific goal or crisis to organize my choices around. Learning how to live in freedom rather than fear was going to be its own kind of healing work. But as I stood on those courthouse steps, breathing in the Arizona sun and feeling the weight of legal vindication settle into my bones, I knew that whatever came next would be built on a foundation of truth rather than lies, of chosen community rather than biological obligation, and of authentic strength rather than adaptive survival. The people who'd tried to erase me had instead forced me to discover exactly how powerful I really was. The first interview request came while I was still packing my hotel room, 3 days after the sentencing. A producer from a national news magazine show had gotten my contact information through Patricia Williams and wanted to discuss featuring my story in an upcoming segment about financial abuse within families. The timing felt overwhelming, but the producer, a woman named Karen Sullivan, explained that they'd been tracking similar cases across the country and mine represented a particularly clear example of how insurance fraud could escalate to attempted murder. I agreed to a preliminary phone conversation, partly out of curiosity about what other cases looked like, and partly because I was still figuring out what my public voice should sound like. Karen explained that they'd identified over 50 similar cases in the past 5 years, situations where family members had manipulated life insurance policies and then staged accidents or medical emergencies to collect payouts. Most of these cases involved elderly parents being exploited by adult children, but a growing number, like mine, involved parents targeting their own children. What struck me most about our conversation was Karen's explanation of the psychological profile that emerged from these cases. The perpetrators were typically people who'd struggled with financial insecurity for extended periods, who'd developed elaborate justifications for their actions, and who'd gradually escalated from minor financial manipulation to major fraud and violence. They often maintained normal public personas while engaging in systematic predation within their families, making it difficult for victims to be believed or for outside observers to recognize warning signs. Karen also told me about the advocacy work being done by other survivors, people who'd escaped similar situations and were now working to change laws, educate financial institutions, and support victims. There was a growing network of survivors, attorneys, and advocates who specialized in family financial abuse, and my case had become a rallying point for their efforts to increase penalties and improve victim protections. The conversation with Karen planted seeds that continued growing over the following weeks. I'd been thinking about my future primarily in terms of personal healing and safety, but talking to her made me realize that my experience could serve a larger purpose. I had knowledge and credibility that could help protect other potential victims, and I had a platform that could amplify messages about financial abuse that needed to be heard. But first, I needed to figure out where I wanted to live and how I wanted to structure my daily life. The freedom to choose felt simultaneously liberating and paralyzing. I could literally go anywhere and be anyone, but that infinite possibility made it difficult to know where to start. I decided to extend my stay in Phoenix for a few more weeks, partly to handle ongoing legal business, but mostly to reconnect with the place where I'd grown up and see if it felt like home anymore. Driving through my old neighborhoods was surreal, in ways I hadn't anticipated. The house where I'd lived with my family looked smaller and shabbier than I remembered, with overgrown landscaping and a for sale sign that had clearly been there for months. The elementary school I'd attended had been renovated and expanded, but the playground equipment was the same, and I found myself sitting on the swings where I'd spent countless recess periods, trying to reconcile my childhood memories with what I now knew about my family's capacity for deception and violence. I also visited the office building where I'd worked before everything happened, curious about whether any of my former colleagues were still there and how they'd react to seeing me again. My old supervisor, Margaret Thompson, happened to be in the lobby when I walked in, and her face went through a series of expressions that ranged from confusion to recognition to something approaching horror as she processed that I was standing in front of her instead of being dead. Margaret explained that my family had told my coworkers I'd died in the car accident, that there had been a small memorial service, and that my desk had been cleaned out and my position filled months ago. Learning that my parents had held a fake funeral for me while I was recovering in North Carolina was jarring in a way I hadn't expected. They'd not only tried to kill me, but they'd also erased me from the lives of people who'd cared about me, people who might have questioned their story if they'd known I was alive. Margaret was obviously uncomfortable with the situation, unsure how to respond to someone whose death she'd grieved and whose family she'd comforted during what she'd believed was a time of tragic loss. I briefly explained that my family had been charged and convicted of attempted murder, that the car accident had been staged, and that I'd been in hiding for safety reasons. I could see her struggling to process this information, trying to reconcile the grief she'd felt over my supposed death with the relief of discovering I was alive and the horror of learning what my family had done. Our conversation was awkward, but also healing in unexpected ways. Margaret told me that several coworkers had questioned aspects of my family's story about the accident, particularly the lack of details about where I'd been buried and the family's reluctance to discuss specifics. Some people had found it strange that my family had seemed to recover from their grief unusually quickly, that they'd talked about life insurance payouts before the memorial service had even been held. Hearing that other people had noticed inconsistencies in my family's story validated my decision to pursue legal action. It reminded me that their deception hadn't been as flawless as they'd believed, that their behavior had raised red flags for observant people, even when those people hadn't known what to do with their suspicions. It also made me realize how many people had been affected by my family's lies, how their fraud had created ripple effects that extended far beyond our immediate family. Margaret offered to help me reconnect with other former colleagues who'd been concerned about me, and over the following days I had coffee with several people who'd known me before my life imploded. These conversations were emotionally complex, involving explanations about trauma and healing that I was still learning how to navigate, but they also helped me understand how much I'd changed during my time away. The person I'd been before the attempted murder felt like someone I'd known in childhood, familiar but distant. That Stacey had been focused on earning approval, on being responsible and helpful and accommodating to family members who were manipulating her generosity. She'd worked hard and saved money and tried to be the kind of daughter her parents claimed to want, not understanding that their real interest was in what they could extract from her rather than who she was as a person. The person I was now had learned to trust her own perceptions, to set boundaries that prioritized her safety and well-being, and to distinguish between people who genuinely cared about her and people who saw her as useful. I'd developed confidence that came from surviving something terrible and choosing to fight back rather than hide forever. I'd learned to value authenticity over approval and community over biological family. During this period of reconnection and reflection, I also started working with Karen Sullivan on the news magazine segment about my case. The process involved multiple interviews, background research, and coordination with law enforcement and legal experts who could provide context about financial abuse trends. What surprised me was how natural it felt to talk publicly about my experience, how therapeutic it was to shape my own narrative instead of having other people define what had happened to me. The news segment aired on a Sunday evening in late fall, reaching an audience of several million viewers across the country. Watching myself on television was strange, but also empowering. Seeing my story presented as an example of survival and resistance rather than just victimization. The segment included interviews with experts who explained how financial abuse typically escalated, resources for viewers who might be experiencing similar manipulation, and information about legal protections that were being developed to help victims. The response to the broadcast was overwhelming and immediate. Within hours of the segment airing, I received dozens of messages through the show's website from people who'd experienced similar abuse, family members who were concerned about elderly relatives, and professionals who worked with victims of financial exploitation. Many of the messages were from people who said my story had helped them recognize patterns in their own families that they'd previously dismissed as normal stress or generational differences. One message particularly stood out, from a woman named Rebecca, whose adult son had been pressuring her to change the beneficiaries on her retirement accounts and life insurance policies. She'd been uncomfortable with his requests, but hadn't understood why until she saw my story and recognized similar patterns of manipulation and escalating pressure. She'd contacted an attorney the morning after the broadcast and discovered that her son had already forged her signature on several financial documents, moving him closer to gaining control over her assets. Reading Rebecca's message made me realize that sharing my story publicly wasn't just therapeutic for me, it was potentially life-saving for other people. If the news segment helped even one person recognize and escape financial abuse before it escalated to physical violence, then the discomfort of public exposure was worthwhile. It also clarified my sense of purpose moving forward, helping me understand that my healing process and my advocacy work could be integrated rather than separate endeavors. Over the following months, I began developing a more systematic approach to survivor advocacy. I started speaking at conferences for financial professionals, law enforcement officers, and social workers who needed to understand how family financial abuse operated and how to recognize warning signs. I worked with attorneys who were developing legal strategies for prosecuting these cases, and with legislators who were drafting laws to strengthen victim protections. The speaking engagements were challenging at first, requiring me to repeatedly revisit traumatic experiences while maintaining enough emotional stability to be credible and effective. But I found that each time I told my story to an audience that could use the information to help other victims, the trauma felt less personal and more purposeful. I was transforming my worst experience into knowledge that could prevent similar harm to other families. I also started working with insurance companies to develop better protocols for detecting fraudulent policies and protecting potential victims. Many companies had antiquated systems that made it easy for family members to manipulate policies without the knowledge of the insured person, and there was growing industry interest in implementing safeguards that could prevent cases like mine. My firsthand experience with the fraud process made me valuable as a consultant, someone who could explain the victim's perspective in ways that helped companies understand vulnerabilities in their systems. The consulting work led to connections with advocacy organizations that specialized in elder abuse, domestic violence, and financial crimes. I learned about the broader ecosystem of family violence and how financial abuse fit into patterns of control and exploitation that affected millions of people. I also learned about other survivors who'd transformed their trauma into advocacy work, people who'd found meaning and healing through efforts to protect others from similar harm. One of the most meaningful connections I made was with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a psychologist who ran a treatment program for families affected by financial abuse. Elena had developed therapeutic approaches specifically designed for situations where victims were related to their abusers, addressing the unique emotional complexity of seeking safety from family members. She invited me to participate in support groups for other survivors, both to continue my own healing work and to serve as a resource for people who were earlier in their recovery process. The support groups were unlike anything I'd experienced during my healing work in Asheville. While the mountain community had provided general trauma support and community connection, these groups were specifically focused on the dynamics of family financial abuse. Participants understood the particular shame and confusion that came from being exploited by people who were supposed to love and protect you, the difficulty of explaining to others why you couldn't just forgive and move on, and the complex grief that came from losing family relationships that had never been as genuine as you'd believed. Working with other survivors also helped me understand how much I'd healed and grown since my time in hiding. When new group members described the hypervigilance, isolation, and identity confusion that characterized the immediate aftermath of family betrayal, I could remember feeling those things but no longer experience them as constant realities. I'd developed tools for managing anxiety, strategies for building healthy relationships, and most importantly, a core sense of self that wasn't dependent on family approval or acceptance. The group work also revealed how unusual my legal victory had been. Most survivors of family financial abuse never saw their abusers held accountable in court, either because the evidence was insufficient, because prosecutors were reluctant to pursue cases involving family members, or because victims were too traumatized or isolated to navigate the legal system effectively. My case had benefited from extensive documentation, a skilled insurance investigator, and attempted murder charges that made it impossible for prosecutors to dismiss as a civil matter. Understanding the rarity of my experience with justice made me more committed to advocacy work that could improve outcomes for other victims. I started working with prosecutors to develop training programs about family financial abuse, helping them understand why these cases deserved serious attention and how to present evidence effectively to juries who might be reluctant to believe that family members could engage in such calculated cruelty. I also began writing about my experience, starting with a blog that detailed the practical aspects of recognizing and escaping family financial abuse. The writing process was therapeutic, but also challenging, requiring me to revisit traumatic experiences while maintaining enough emotional distance to provide useful information rather than just personal catharsis. I found that writing helped clarify my thoughts about healing and justice, forcing me to articulate insights that had been gestating since the trial ended. The blog attracted attention from publishers who were interested in a full-length book about my experience. After several conversations with agents and editors, I decided to move forward with a book project that would combine my personal story with practical information about financial abuse, legal resources for victims, and guidance for family members and professionals who wanted to help. The book would take over a year to write, but it felt like a natural extension of the advocacy work I was already doing. As I settled into this new identity as a survivor advocate, I also had to figure out where I wanted to live permanently. I'd been staying in temporary housing in Phoenix while handling legal business and developing my advocacy work, but I needed to create a stable home base that could support both my personal healing and my professional commitments. I considered returning to Asheville, but that community now felt like a place I'd needed during early recovery, rather than where I wanted to build my long-term future. Instead, I found myself drawn to Denver, a city that offered both urban opportunities and mountain access, a thriving nonprofit sector, and a strong network of advocacy organizations. Colorado had also recently passed comprehensive legislation addressing financial elder abuse, making it a hub for the kind of policy work I was becoming involved in. I rented a small house in a neighborhood that felt safe but not isolated, close enough to the city center for work, but with trails and open space for the hiking and outdoor time that had become essential to my well-being. The move to Denver marked another transition in my understanding of home and belonging. For most of my life, home had been defined by family relationships, by the place where my parents and sister lived, and where I was expected to maintain connections regardless of how those relationships affected my well-being. During my time in Asheville, home had been defined by safety and healing, by distance from danger and access to supportive community. Now, home was becoming something I was actively creating rather than something I was born into or fled to. It was a place where I could do meaningful work, maintain healthy relationships, and continue growing into the person I was becoming, rather than trying to recover the person I'd been before the trauma. It was defined by choice and intention, rather than obligation or necessity, and that felt revolutionary after decades of family relationships that had been characterized by manipulation and control. Setting up my life in Denver also required practical decisions about safety and privacy that I was still learning to navigate. I'd legally reclaimed my original name after the trial, but I still needed to be careful about my address and contact information being publicly accessible. My parents were in prison, but they had extended family and friends who might blame me for their convictions, and Madison would eventually be released and might seek contact or retaliation. I worked with security consultants to establish protocols for protecting my personal information while maintaining enough public presence to do advocacy work effectively. This included strategies for handling mail and packages, screening requests for interviews or speaking engagements, and maintaining situational awareness without falling back into the hypervigilance that had characterized my early recovery period. The balance between public advocacy and personal safety was delicate and constantly evolving. I wanted to be accessible to other survivors who might benefit from my experience, but I also needed to protect the peace and stability I'd worked so hard to create. I found that having clear boundaries and support systems made it possible to engage publicly without feeling constantly vulnerable, and that the meaning I found in the advocacy work made the security precautions feel worthwhile rather than burdensome. As my first year in Denver drew to a close, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that night in Phoenix when my family had tried to kill me. I'd gone from being someone who defined herself primarily through family relationships and professional achievements to someone who understood her worth as independent of other people's approval or acceptance. I'd learned to trust my own perceptions, set boundaries that prioritized my well-being, and build community with people who chose to care about me rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate me. Most importantly, I discovered that healing from trauma wasn't just about returning to who you were before something terrible happened. Sometimes healing meant becoming someone entirely new, someone stronger and more authentic than you'd ever been able to be when you were trying to meet other people's expectations. The person I was becoming had been forged in the fire of betrayal and violence, but she was also shaped by the support of communities that had chosen to help her heal and the satisfaction of work that transformed suffering into service. I still carried the scars of what my family had done to me, and I probably always would. But those scars had become part of a larger story about survival, resistance, and the possibility of creating chosen family with people who understood that love meant supporting each other's growth rather than profiting from each other's vulnerabilities. That story was still being written, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the pen. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, almost 3 years to the day after I'd woken up in that Phoenix hospital bed. I recognized the handwriting immediately, even though I hadn't seen it in years. Madison's familiar looping script on a plain white envelope with no return address, postmarked from a halfway house in Tucson where she was completing the final months of her sentence. My hands shook slightly as I opened it, not from fear, but from the strange sensation of receiving communication from someone who belonged to a chapter of my life I'd thought was permanently closed. The letter was brief, written on lined paper, in the careful penmanship of someone who'd had plenty of time to think about what they wanted to say. She wrote that she'd been following my advocacy work from prison, reading articles about my speaking engagements and the book I'd published 6 months earlier. She said she was proud of what I'd accomplished, but understood why I'd never want to hear from her again. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or a relationship, just wanted me to know that she'd spent the last 3 years in therapy, trying to understand how she'd become someone capable of trying to kill her own sister for money. The most powerful part of the letter was her description of the therapy work she'd been doing around family dynamics and financial desperation. She'd come to understand that our parents had been grooming both of us for exploitation our entire lives, teaching us to measure our worth through their approval and training us to compete with each other for resources and attention. She realized that she'd been as much a victim of their manipulation as I had been, even though she'd ultimately become a perpetrator herself. Madison wrote that she'd started speaking to other incarcerated women about recognizing financial abuse and manipulation within families, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about how desperation and family pressure could lead to irreversible choices. She'd also been working with prison counselors to develop programming around financial literacy and healthy family boundaries, trying to help other women avoid the mistakes that had landed her behind bars. Reading her letter, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I couldn't have processed without the years of therapy and healing work I'd done since the trial. There was still anger about what she'd done to me, grief for the sister relationship we'd never been able to have, and wariness about her motivations for reaching out. But there was also something that might have been forgiveness, or at least an understanding that hurt people often hurt other people, and that healing required acknowledging the full complexity of how trauma and manipulation could cycle through generations. I didn't respond to Madison's letter immediately. Instead, I brought it to my therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, who'd been helping me navigate the ongoing emotional complexities of building a life after family trauma. Sarah had specialized training in family violence and understood the unique challenges faced by survivors whose abusers were blood relatives. She'd helped me develop strategies for maintaining boundaries while processing grief for relationships that had never been healthy, but had still been foundational to my sense of identity. Sarah and I talked about what it meant to receive communication from Madison after years of silence, and what kind of response, if any, would serve my healing process. She reminded me that forgiveness was a process rather than a decision, and that I didn't owe anyone forgiveness on their timeline rather than my own. She also pointed out that my response could be guided by what felt authentic and self-protective rather than what seemed most generous or socially expected. After several weeks of consideration, I decided to write back. Not because I wanted to rebuild a relationship with Madison, but because I wanted to close that chapter of my life on my own terms rather than leaving it open indefinitely. My response was brief but honest, acknowledging that I was glad she was doing therapeutic work but that I wasn't ready for ongoing contact. I wished her well in her continued healing and reintegration process, but I also made it clear that I'd built a life that didn't include space for people who'd once tried to harm me. Sending that letter felt like laying down a burden I hadn't realized I was still carrying. For years, I'd wondered what I would say to Madison if I ever had the chance, how I would balance accountability with compassion, justice with mercy. Actually, writing those words and putting them in the mail gave me a sense of completion that I hadn't expected, a feeling that I'd responded with integrity rather than reactivity. The letter exchange with Madison coincided with a significant milestone in my advocacy work. The National Coalition Against Financial Abuse had invited me to keynote their annual conference, speaking to an audience of over 1,000 attorneys, social workers, law enforcement officers, and survivors from across the country. The speech would be my largest platform yet for discussing family financial abuse and the need for systematic changes in how institutions responded to these crimes. Preparing for the keynote required me to distill everything I'd learned about financial abuse, trauma, healing, and justice into a presentation that could educate professionals while inspiring other survivors. I wanted to strike a balance between sharing personal details that humanize the issue and providing practical information that attendees could use in their work. Most importantly, I wanted to communicate that survival was possible, that healing was achievable, and that speaking out could transform individual trauma into collective protection. The day of the conference, I stood backstage in a convention center ballroom, listening to the buzz of conversation from 1,000 people who'd gathered to learn about protecting vulnerable adults from financial exploitation. The magnitude of the audience felt overwhelming until I reminded myself that each person in that room had the potential to recognize warning signs, support a victim, or prevent a crime. My story could ripple out through their work to reach people I'd never meet, but who might benefit from the knowledge I'd gained through my own terrible experience. Walking onto that stage felt like the culmination of a journey I'd never planned to take. 3.5 years earlier, I'd been a woman so broken by family betrayal that I'd disappeared completely rather than face the people who'd tried to kill me. Now I was someone who stood in front of crowds and spoke confidently about trauma and recovery, someone whose expertise was sought by professionals and policymakers who were working to protect other families from similar devastation. The speech itself felt both deeply personal and completely professional, as I'd learned to weave my individual story into larger conversations about systemic change and victim support. I talked about the warning signs I'd missed, the ways financial abuse had escalated to physical violence, and the resources that had helped me survive and eventually thrive. I also spoke about the importance of believing survivors, even when their stories seemed impossible or their abusers seemed respectable. The response from the audience was immediate and powerful. During the question and answer period, attorneys asked about legal strategies for prosecuting family financial abuse cases. Social workers wanted guidance on supporting clients who were being exploited by relatives. Law enforcement officers sought advice on investigating these complex crimes where victims were often reluctant to cooperate with prosecution efforts. But the most meaningful responses came from other survivors in the audience, people who approached me afterward to share their own stories of family financial abuse and to thank me for helping them feel less alone in their experiences. One woman told me that my book had helped her recognize that her adult son's manipulation of her finances constituted abuse rather than just family stress. Another survivor said that hearing me speak had given her courage to testify against her brother, who'd stolen her inheritance and tried to gain control of her disability benefits. These conversations reminded me why the advocacy work felt so essential despite the emotional cost of repeatedly revisiting traumatic experiences. Every person who recognized abuse earlier because of my story, every victim who felt empowered to seek help, every professional who learned to respond more effectively represented a victory against the isolation and shame that family financial abuse was designed to create. After the conference, I returned to Denver with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity about my future direction. The advocacy work was no longer something I was doing to make sense of my trauma. It had become a calling that gave my life meaning and connected me to communities of people working for justice and healing. I'd found my place in the world, not despite what my family had done to me, but because of how I'd chosen to transform that experience into service. Over the following months, I continued expanding my speaking schedule and writing projects, while also deepening my personal relationships and self-care practices. I'd learned that sustainable advocacy required strong boundaries and ongoing attention to my own well-being, that I couldn't help other people heal if I wasn't continuing to prioritize my own recovery process. I'd also started dating again, something that had felt impossible during my early recovery when I couldn't trust my own judgment about people's intentions or motivations. Building intimate relationships after family betrayal required learning to distinguish between healthy vulnerability and dangerous naivety, between appropriate caution and paranoid isolation. It took time and patience, but I eventually developed the confidence to open my heart to people who'd earned my trust through consistent, caring behavior over time. My partner, Alex, was someone I'd met through mutual friends in Denver's nonprofit community, a social worker who understood trauma and respected boundaries without needing extensive explanations about my history or healing process. Alex had their own experience with family dysfunction and had also done significant therapeutic work around building healthy relationships despite difficult origins. We'd been together for over a year, and I was learning what it felt like to be loved by someone who supported my growth rather than trying to control or exploit my resources. The relationship with Alex also taught me what family could look like when it was based on choice rather than biology, on mutual support rather than obligation or manipulation. We'd created traditions and routines that felt nourishing rather than draining, conversations that deepened intimacy rather than creating conflict or competition. It was the kind of partnership I'd never seen modeled in my biological family, where relationships had been characterized by secrecy, manipulation, and transactional exchanges rather than genuine care and connection. As I reflected on the journey, from that hospital bed in Phoenix to this life I'd built in Denver, I was struck by how completely I'd been transformed by the experience of surviving attempted murder by my own family. The woman I'd been before the insurance fraud had been focused on earning approval, on being useful and accommodating and grateful for whatever scraps of affection her family offered. She'd measured her worth through other people's satisfaction, with her performance rather than through her own values and aspirations. The woman I'd become understood that love wasn't supposed to hurt, that family relationships weren't automatically healthy just because they were biological, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was establish firm boundaries. With people who'd proven themselves unsafe, I'd learned to trust my own perceptions, to prioritize my well-being, and to build community with people who chose to care about me rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate me. Most importantly, I'd discovered that healing from trauma didn't mean returning to who you were before something terrible happened. Sometimes healing meant becoming someone entirely new, someone stronger and more authentic than you'd ever been, able to be when you were trying to meet other people's expectations. The person I'd become had been forged in the fire of betrayal and violence, but she was also shaped by the support of communities that had chosen to help her heal, and the satisfaction of work that transformed suffering into service. My parents were still in prison and would be for many years to come. Madison was completing her reintegration process in a halfway house, trying to build a life that acknowledged her crimes while working toward genuine redemption. We might never have relationships again, and that was okay. I'd learned that healing, didn't require reconciliation with people who'd harmed you, and that forgiveness didn't mean accepting ongoing contact or relationship. What mattered was that I'd reclaimed my voice, my power, and my right to define my own life on my own terms. I'd refused to let their attempted murder become the defining story of my existence, instead transforming it into one chapter in a larger narrative about survival, resistance, and the possibility of building authentic community with people who understood that love meant supporting each other's growth rather than profiting from each other's vulnerabilities. Standing in my kitchen in Denver on a sunny spring morning, reading Madison's letter one final time before filing it away, I felt something I'd never experienced during my childhood in Phoenix: complete peace with my choices and complete confidence in my ability to protect and care for myself. I'd survived the worst thing I could imagine and discovered that I was stronger, wiser, and more capable of love than I'd ever known. The scars from my family's betrayal would always be part of my story, but they were no longer the only part. They'd become integrated into a larger narrative about the possibility of healing, the power of chosen community, and the way individual trauma could be transformed into collective protection through advocacy and service. That story was still being written, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the pen. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.